I kept tilting the screen back and forth on the first day with the Samsung Galaxy Book5 360, not because I needed to adjust the angle, but because I couldn't stop feeling how perfectly balanced that hinge was. When you pull this laptop out of the bag, the first thing you register is the density. It's 3.2 pounds, which just doesn't sound like much until you try holding it as a tablet for more than a few minutes. It has this slim, almost flat profile that reminds me of a MacBook Pro, except with edges that feel slightly warmer in the hand, not quite as cold or severe. The metal chassis has a matte texture that catches light without collecting fingerprints the way glossy surfaces do. And when you open it, the hinge moves with this buttery smoothness that still locks into place without wobbling. I kept flipping it all the way back just to feel that resistance. It's firm enough that the screen holds at any angle, but loose enough that you don't have to grip both sides to adjust it. The bezels around the 15.6-inch screen are thin enough that they disappear into the experience, blending directly into the display glass without any visible seam. There's a 1080p webcam tucked into the top bezel that you barely notice until you need it. The keyboard sits flush with the body, keys spaced wide despite the number pad squeezed in onto the right side, and the trackpad is offset to the left. Something that threw me off at first, but after a few days my hand just started landing there automatically. The first time I opened 5 Chrome tabs while streaming a 4K video on YouTube, I expected the fans to kick in like they do on my older laptop. Instead, it stayed completely silent. The Intel Core Ultra 7 processor handled it without breaking a sweat, and the AMOLED display made everything look absurdly vivid, like colors were being pulled out of the screen rather than just displayed. It's not a deal breaker, but when I started downloading a large game file, the fans finally woke up with this persistent whirring noise that felt louder than it should have been for such a basic task. The vents are on the bottom, so the sound is muffled when it's sitting on a desk, but lifts it onto your lap and it becomes much more noticeable. Compared to the ARM-based laptops I've used recently, the Galaxy Book5 360 feels snappier in everyday use. Apps open faster, nothing needs to be emulated, and multitasking between windows doesn't cause that split-second stutter you sometimes get with lighter processors. The battery surprised me more than anything else. I got over 10 to 14 hours on average doing typical work, and it actually stayed asleep when I closed the lid instead of drawing silently in my bag like past Intel laptops. When you look at the product page, Samsung really leans hard into the 360-degree hinge and the S Pen functionality, which makes sense because those are the standout hardware features. They talk about AI-powered flexibility and the dynamic AMOLED anti-glare display, and those things do show up in real use, but what they barely mention is how good the typing experience is. The keys have this tactile feel that makes long writing sessions almost enjoyable, and that's something I noticed within the first hour of using it. They also don't really talk about the fan noise under moderate load, which is one of those things you only discover after you've owned it for a few days. It's interesting what gets highlighted and what gets quietly tucked away in the footnotes, the features that look good in the marketing versus the ones that actually shape how you feel about using it every day. I started reaching for the Samsung Galaxy Book5 360 more often than my usual laptop within the first week, mostly because it didn't feel like a compromise. The 15.6-inch screen gave me enough room to actually work with 2 windows side by side without feeling cramped, and the AMOLED made watching anything after work feel like a treat rather than background noise. The hinge turned out to be more useful than I expected. I flipped it back on a flight and propped it up like a tent on the tray table, which saved me from worrying about the person in front reclining into it. The trackpad being off-center took a few days to stop feeling awkward, but once I adjusted my hand, it just naturally landed in the right spot. What I didn't expect to appreciate was how cool it stayed during normal use. No warm spots on the bottom, no random heat spikes then opening Spotify. The S Pen sits in a drawer now because I don't draw or take handwritten notes, but the keyboard more than makes up for it with its spacing and responsiveness. You don't really notice how much smoother your workflow becomes until you go back to something that feels just slightly slower, slightly warmer, and slightly louder. The touchpad sensitivity was too low out of the box, and after I cranked it up in Windows settings, I kept accidentally tapping it while typing, which made the cursor jump mid-sentence. It's not a deal breaker, but something I kept noticing until I trained myself to keep my palms higher. Both USB-C ports are on the left side, which means you always have to plug in the charger from that direction. So one of those small things that only becomes obvious after a few hours of moving between desks. The screen can get overly reflective when displaying darker scenes, and sometimes colors look slightly washed out depending on the lighting in the room. It doesn't ruin the experience, but it's there, especially if you're watching something moody or working late without overhead lights. If you're the kind of person who needs a laptop that can handle full work days without hunting for an outlet, And you want something that feels well built without being fragile. The Samsung Galaxy Book5 360 is absolutely worth it. But if your day is mostly heavy multitasking with dozens of tabs or serious video editing, the performance might feel like it's holding back just slightly. The 360-degree hinge makes more sense if you travel often or like having flexibility in how you consume media. If you never fold it back, you're paying for a feature you won't use. It's the kind of laptop that quietly does its job well, without making you think about battery percentages or fan noise every few hours.